Hi friends, welcome to Anti-Static. Well, today I'm happy to announce a series of tools that I've been working on and using for the past 15 years of my motion graphics career. And I'm making this panel of 25 tools available for free for your enjoyment. Let's jump in and I'll give you a tour. Alright, so if you follow the link in the description, it's going to open up this GitHub page. Now don't freak out if you've never used it before. Just go up to this code button, you're going to click on it, and just click this download zip button. And that's going to download all the files you need into your downloads folder. If you open up that zip file, then you should see this AS toolbox. Just open up that folder. You've got a README in here, which is really just the same information that's already on the page. The installation is really simple. It has all the instructions right here, but just to walk you through it really quickly, once you unzip that folder, you go into your applications folder, find the latest version of Adobe After Effects. Open that up and then look for the scripts folder and then the scripts UI panels. And if you open that up and then just drag this file into that folder, then that's all you need to do. Make sure that you restart After Effects, and when you do, if you go up to Window, you should see the Anti-Static ToolBox right here at the top. Open it up and you're ready to go. Now you probably want to dock this panel somewhere. And one thing you need to be aware of anytime you're using panels is that sometimes they can get cut off. But there is a really easy fix for this. If you just grab this, let's say I'm going to move it over here to the side. And then I'm going to open this up just a little bit wider. So I want to be able to see my properties panel as well. I can move this out. Now if you just go up to this menu here, click on this panel group settings and change this to a stacked panel group. And then it's going to kind of squash itself. But if you just hit the tilde key on your keyboard to open up just that panel, then we can just grab this blue line and drag it all the way down to the bottom. You can see the border of our panel right here. Now if I hit that tilde key again to collapse that up, now you can see I've got scroll bars that are fitting my panel in perfectly. Just move it over a little bit. Now everything I need is right in here. Alright, so now that I've got my panel installed, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. And we've got these 3 tabs here of different tools. I'm going to start with the most interesting one. This toolbox has some really powerful features, especially if you're working with a large layer set, lots of layers. Alright, so here I have a grid of 36 squares. And I'm just going to select all of these and just click on this effector. And it's going to create an effector layer for us. If I just click on that, you can drag it around. You can see what it's doing. It's just moving those boxes around based on the position and the proximity of this circle. Now I can go into the properties and adjust the size of that effector. I can also adjust the fall off. So if I want to make it a little more abrupt, I can just take that down. This is a percentage that will change the affected position. So if I want to make this really subtle, I can take it down. Or if you want to go the opposite way, you can go nuts. So I'm just going to pull up this amount, affected position a little bit. And then you can also play around with this random some. If you want to have not quite so perfect, just add a little bit of randomness by pulling up this random. You can also add them, change the random seed if you want a different pattern. Just bump this up 1 and 2, whatever. Now I'm just going to undo that. Go back to our grid. I'm going to select all my boxes again. And this time I'm just going to check the position, scale, rotation, and opacity and click a new effector. And you can see it's going to just affect all of those properties for each of these boxes. And again, all of those properties are going to be listed here so that I can control just how much I want them to be affected. So maybe I'll turn the position down quite a bit. This scale is going to be the absolute scale that I want each of these boxes to go to. So if I turn this down to like 20, then they're going to get real small as this effector comes closer. The rotation will be the amount of rotation that each box will go through before it gets to sort of the center hot spot, or whatever that is depending on the fall off. So it's set to 360 right now, so they're going to do a full rotation. If I set this to 90, then obviously they're just only going to go 90 degrees. But there's also this other option, which is look at effector. If I click on that, then everything is going to turn toward the effector. It's a little hard to see. Maybe let's turn this. Let's turn the affected opacity up to 100, so that's basically off. And make the scale maybe 120. maybe easier to see if it's on the edge. You see all these boxes are going to look toward the center, look toward that middle part. Kind of cool, pretty fun to play with. Yeah, so the opacity you can just set to whatever it is you want to be. Now this is again going to be an absolute position. So if I select this label group, let's say I want to change the scale of these down to 50. And let's also change the opacity to 40. And then I go back to my effector, and let's say I want the affected opacity to be 100. So it's starting at 40 and going up to 100. Same thing with the scale. Starting at 50, we're going up to 120. We can bump this up to whatever we want. And just move these things around. It's really fun to play around with. Just set this in the center. Sometimes it's fun to just grow it or animate the fall off and just see how that affects all of your objects. One thing to keep in mind is that you can have multiple effectors affecting different properties of the same objects. So let's say I want to have one position effector, and then I'm going to select this group again, and this time let's do a scale effector. So now I have two different ones. They're in the same spot, but if I just move these around, I can affect these each separately. You can go into this preview and change the color of one of these just to make it a little easier, maybe to keep track of them. Sometimes you want to be able to affect something other than the position, scale, rotation, or opacity. And that's why each of these affected objects is also going to have an auxiliary slider put onto it now. And that slider is going to give us the value of how affected it is by our effector. So for example, I'm looking at this top left square right here. Right now it is 0% affected, but if I move this thing all the way up here, you can say that same one is now 97.47. So now what's great about that is I can use that information to drive all kinds of effects. So let's say, for example, I just wanted to add let's add a fast blur. I'm going to click on the blur radius and just drag this pick whip to the auxiliary slider. I can drag it right here, I can drag it all the way up here, and now they're linked together so that as I move this closer, the square is going to get blurrier. Right? Now I can just copy that blur, select our label group, and paste. Now every blue square is going to have that same effect, that same property applied to it. Another thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to have any of these selected. If you just want to use that auxiliary, you can just uncheck all of these. It's still going to create an effector, and each one of these is going to have an auxiliary slider, so you can drive all kinds of effects. All right, let's move on to our next tool. The next one is called Stringer, and if you just click this button, it's by default going to create 4 points for you. So it's going to create 4 nulls, and if I just move these around, you can see that it's just creating this string in between these 4 nulls. So I created this stringer shape, and this is just a shape layer. So I can change the stroke width, I can change the color if I want, and I can just animate around these points. Pretty handy. I can also click this closed option. Let's say maybe I want 6 points now, and it's going to create a closed shape. Here we also have a Bezier option. So I'm just going to click on that. Open this up. Let me just solo these layers so we can get rid of that grid for just a minute. And then if I move these points around, I should have unchecked the closed option, but there's another feature on here. If you click on the stringer object, there's actually a checkbox if you change your mind later and want it to be closed or open. So now I want to affect these. I've got these in and out tangents for each one of these points. So if I just grab this one, I'm just going to move it. And by default, these tangents are locked together. So if I move one, if I move the in point, the out point is going to move in a mirrored fashion. I can, of course, uncheck that. And then if I want to turn on, when I turn on the out point, I can see it there and I can move it independently. But usually I find that having these linked is really helpful. So I'm just going to set this back to where it was. And if I just select this label group, then I can pull each one of these. Oh, not the stringer. I can pull each one of these out a little bit, just get kind of a curvy, wiggly line. Each one of these is going to be parented to its the main point. So you can make these really squiggly lines. These stringers can be created in between objects, as you might have noticed up here. So if I just grab all of these layers, and I'm going to check this existing points, turn off Bezier and turn off closed, and just hit stringer. Now it's going to create a string in between all of these squares. And if I just move any of these around, they'll be connected. Now what's great about this is that you can create multiple strings for any number of points. So let's say I just want to create a square. I'm just going to grab every one of these outside boxes here and click on closed and just create a new object. And then maybe I want to create one from this one to this one. Just create another stringer object. Here to here. Let's just go around the square. And then if you move any one of these points, those related strings are going to move the way that you would expect them to. Alright, so now you can do some fun things like, let's just grab this label group, create another position effector, and we can move this around and see how that affects our strings and connections. Alright, moving on. This is a tool I call the Text Greebler, and what it's going to do is just create strings of random characters. Sometimes that's really helpful. You want to do some sort of background or some kind of element that has just random data. So here I'm just going to create a text greebler with an uppercase letter and then 2 numbers. And I'll just hit that button, and you'll see it's done exactly what it said. 1 uppercase letter and then 2 numbers. And this is going to be animated. If you check on the text greebler controls, you'll see this posterize time command in here. And this is going to say how many times per second should this change. So if I set this to 15, that means 15 times per second, or every other frame. This is a 30 frame per second comp. So every other frame, I'm going to get a new number. Okay? If I set it down to 0, then it's just going to not change at all. It's just going to choose a random number and stay there. And of course you can change the random seed if you want to get something a little different. Now I can just duplicate this layer, and it's just going to, every time, choose a different combination. They're all going to be tied to this same panel. So if I change the settings here, they're going to change for all of those. Now this text greebler can also take in any string that you add to it. So for example, I want to say server underscore lowercase lowercase. And let's create 4 copies of that. And it's just going to replace those special key characters with a random number. Right? So you can add in your own text however you like. All right, this next tool is the property manager, and what it's going to do is manage properties by helping write some expressions and wrangle all those properties together. So if I just select all of these squares, let's say I'm going to open up this one, and I'm going to, now that I have all the squares selected, I'm going to command or control click on the properties that I want to add. So let's add a scale and a rotation, and go ahead and do opacity as well, and click on this property manager. And it's going to create a new property manager on top here. And it's going to link all of those properties together. So here all our scales are together. We can unlink these if we want to do different sizes for the X and Y scale. And the opacity, of course, the rotation, they're all linked together. Very handy. All right, so you can link this property manager to any property. Especially helpful when you've got something that's kind of down deep, like in a group with the contents of a shape layer. So for example, I can open up the shape, and let's grab this roundness, and maybe we'll open up the stroke and select the stroke width. You can even link colors. So I'll select this color as well and create a new property manager. And now we can control the roundness of each of those, as well as the stroke size, and oh good golly, we probably want to change this color down to something a little more palatable. Alright, so next we have the wiggle manager, which is really similar. We can just select all the layers that we want to add. And by holding down Command or Control, we can just add the properties that we want to wiggle. And so I'll just choose a couple down there, maybe open up this rectangle and choose the size. Let's get this roundness, and maybe this fill color. And we'll hit Wiggle Manager. Ooh-wee! Everything just kind of goes a little crazy. Now, of course, we can just change these down. Now, wiggle, the color is expecting a value between 0 and 1. So this is going to default to 1. If I set this to 0.3, it's just going to do something a lot tamer. And we can change the wiggle amount and the wiggle time. So for example, if I set this time up to like 20 times per second, then the roundness is going to change quite often. Let's change the rotation up to 20 as well. So they're very jittery now. All right, next up we have the palette manager. Now this one, you want to select all your layers and find a color property. In this case, we'll just use the fill color. And again, I'm going to command select that or control select and hit this palette manager. And everything's going to disappear because it's going to create a new manager over here with 10 different colors listed. And then as I just start to add colors in here, you'll start to see these come back in. Because what it's going to do is look at this palette that we've created and choose a random color from this palette to color our objects. And then I've got 7 colors here, so I'm going to change the color count to 7. And now it's going to randomly choose a color from this palette. Now I can choose to unclick this randomize button if you want to go in order, and it's just going to pick the next color in the order. So if I set this to 6, now it's just going to pick the next color. We can even animate these colors by just putting a quick expression on here on the random seed. If I click on that and just write posterize time, say 3 times per second, and then time. And now 3 times per second, each of these squares is going to pick another color from our palette. All right, I can always change these later if I decide like this is not a good palette and it looks really bad and terrible. You can always just update these to whatever you like. All right, and then these last couple of tools in here are just a couple of helpful things that I use often. So let's go ahead and I'm going to change this composition setting to something lighter. And we can just add a vignette, which is just going to mask out the edges, get a little bit of darkness there, can adjust the opacity of this. And then this glitch matte tool will just create 2 different layers. One is an adjustment layer to which you can add any effects that you want to affect the layers below it. And the second one is just a sort of a luma matte that kind of has this glitchy effect. That layer will have a couple of basic controls on it to control the size and width of the fractal as well as the speed of how quickly it's evolving. And then this layer you can just add kind of whatever effect we want. Here I just have a basic transform with the width set to 120. So it's just going to move little bits of all the layers below it to create a glitchy effect. All right, so that's our utilities panel. Now, hopefully you can see there's a lot of really powerful tools in here that you can use in conjunction with one another to make some awesome stuff. Next up, we're going to move over to the timeline and just show some of these tools that are in here. This one is pretty simple. I'm just going to grab all these squares and just shorten the length of them. And then really quickly, obviously, this is just going to randomize the endpoints for each of these layers automatically based on the amount of frames that you have here. This one is going to stagger the endpoints, which is really helpful. I use this all the time for just making things come on a little bit later than the previous one. So if I set this to 1 frame, it's just going to stagger each of these by 1 frame. And sometimes 1 frame is not even fast enough. You want it to be, we've got a lot of layers like this, so you can actually set this to less than 1. So let's set this to 0.3. And then if I play this through, see very quickly all of those squares are going to come on and then come off. All right, next we have this fade in, fade out, which is really just based on the in and out point of the layer. So this is set to 10 frames. If I just hit that button, each of these is going to fade in over 10 frames and then fade out over 10 frames based on when the out point is of the layer. So if I fade these all in and out, I can just grab them, stagger the endpoints, and then we got a pretty cool effect. All right, next up is loop keyframes. Let's say I've got a square and I just want it to blink. I can just hit an opacity keyframe, go forward a few frames, set this to 20, and then if I just grab these both and hit loop keyframes, it's just going to continue to loop them in a ping pong forever until the layer out point. Loop compositions works kind of similarly, but it's with compositions. So oftentimes I'll have a composition and I've done some bit of animation and I want it to just continue on. So if I just grab each of these, I hit that button, it's going to time remap them, and then I can just drag the end of this out. So it's just going to continue to loop these out forever until that layer out point ends. All right, duplicate layers is obviously just a quick way to make a lot of copies of things. Next up is randomize layer order, and it does just what it says. It's just going to take our stack over here and randomize the order. Sometimes I find that helpful for making different patterns and adding a little bit of chaos into my composition. All right, next up we have the proximity reorder. What that's going to do is reorder all of our layers in the timeline based on their proximity to a point. So I'm just going to select all of these and add a little bit of animation. I'm just going to hit Option S to make a scale keyframe right at the beginning. Move that ahead a little bit, and then I'm going to start these out at about 20% of their scale. All right, so now I have all these boxes that are scaling up from 20 to 100%. Now I can select each of these, and I'm going to hit this proximity reorder button. And what it's going to do is the script is going to run through every layer that's selected, and it's going to reorder it based on its proximity. By default, that point is the center of the composition that it's looking for. So now the layers that are at the top of our stack are the ones that are closest to the center. And the layers that are at the bottom of our stack are the ones farthest away. Now this is really helpful because now I can select all these layers and hit this stagger endpoints again. And now if I play this through, we get this sort of radial effect. Similar to what our layer effectors can do, but just got a different way of doing it with a little more flexibility maybe if you want to move things around. I should mention also that the stagger endpoints works based on the order that you select layers. So if I select these from the bottom to the top and then hit stagger endpoints, then we're going to see this come in from the outside to the center. Now, as you can see, this proximity reorder is comparing these layers positions to the center of the comp and reordering them based on that proximity. But if you wanted to use a different point, you can just hit this create target point, and it's going to create a new null. I can move this wherever I want, and then I can select our label group again and hit that proximity reorder. And now it's going to take into consideration that point that we created and reorder our layers based on proximity to that point instead of the center. Let's just stagger these. There we go. All right, what I have here is a grid of 36 objects that are all being affected by a position effector. Now what I want to do is go into my utilities. I'm going to create some text scribbles. Just do an uppercase, number, and create 36 of them. I'm going to hit that button and let it go through each of these, creating every layer we need. Now I'm just going to grab all of these and change the label to orange. And then I'm going to pull them down here to the top of our boxes. Now, this next tool, the label mate, is really helpful for a situation like this. I've got 36 different text scribbles. I want them to be positioned and I want them to be parented to each of those 36 boxes, but in order to do that manually it would be really annoying to go through each one and parent one to another. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to just open up this timeline, grab all of my text layers and all of my boxes. I know that each one has 36 exactly. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to say parent the orange label to the blue, and make sure I hit this reposition button. And then when I click that button, it's going to move each of those text boxes to, it's going to parent each of these text boxes to the next available box, and it's going to position it based on that box as well. Now I want to grab this label group and I'll just pull these down a little bit, make sure they're kind of centered in the box. Cool. Now I can just grab this layer effector and see that my boxes and text boxes are all being affected because all our text scribbles have been parented to the boxes below them. Now my next tool is called Zebra Deselect. Let's say I have a bunch of layers selected and I want to just select every other one in the timeline. I can just set this to 1 and deselect. Now it's going to deselect every other layer. So now I can move these boxes. Let's say I want to create a different pattern where each of these boxes is right next to another one. Then let's grab this group again Let's make this 5 and deselect. Now I just have the first one here. Just handy sometimes and useful for creating patterns. Alright, next up is the canvas tools. Let's say we've got a bunch of squares on our canvas and we want to center them all. Easily just hit this button and get them right in the center. Sometimes you want to just center one axis. So maybe just center the Y or just center the X. Sometimes you just want to randomize the positions by a certain amount. Let's make this 10 by 10. And I can just randomize those. Just give a little bit of an organic feel. Let's center that again. Maybe sometimes I want to spread them all over my comp. If I hit this button, it'll just grab the comp dimensions and then I can just spread them wherever I want. If I don't like that, just recenter and do it again. All right, here's another useful tool. Let's recenter all of these. All right, here I have 9 boxes selected. And here I just want to stagger the X point. Just hit that button. And I can just move these out a little bit, maybe a little bit more. Maybe next time I want to do the Y and just stagger the Y position. You can recenter these and just pull them up like this. Real helpful. Of course, this works in Z space. Also, these layers are 3D. You just center all these positions. Change the Z order. Now let's create a new camera. You see those layers going back in Z space. Next up, we have the radial position tool. So I just select all of these and create radial position. Maybe I'll make this a little bit smaller radius. And it's just going to spread these layers out based on the radius that we have selected. If I hit this rotate button, then it will also rotate them so that they're all facing toward the center. Let's say I've got one and I want to just duplicate a few of those, maybe 20 of them on a radius of 300. Just hit that button. It's going to duplicate and rotate and position those shapes for you. Now again, if I want to animate these, I can just hit a position keyframe on each of those, move ahead a little bit. I'm going to turn off this duplicate and turn down the radius maybe. So it's just going to move in like that. Next up is the grid position, and I bet you can guess what this does. If I just want to put in how many columns I want and the gap size and hit this button, it's going to position my elements. Now I have 9 selected here, but let's say I had 14 and I select a 4x4 grid. It's just going to position as many as you have. So there's not quite full 16 to make out there. If I want to duplicate 2 more, I can grab those and hit that button again. Alternatively, of course, we can just select 1 and hit this duplicate button, and it will duplicate the amount that we need to make a full grid. All right, and then next up is the grid move tool. If I just turn on my grid, it'll be helpful for you to see what's happening here. I'm just going to select all these layers and Option P to hit a position keyframe, move ahead 10 frames, and then I'm going to check this to 4 and set the distance to 100 is good, and maybe I'll set this multiplier to 3, and I'm going to check this button, and I'm just going to push this button to show you what's happening. It's just going to move each of our layers in a grid-like pattern. So let's move forward another 10 frames and hit this button again, and move again, and push it again, grid move. All right, so you see these are just being moved according to the grid. So each time, based on our parameters, each of these layers is going to be moved in one of 4 directions, up, down, left, or right, at a distance of 100 pixels, or a multiple of 3, or it's going to be not moved at all. So because I have this box checked, the distance could be 0 that it's moved, or it could be 100, or 200, or 300, because we have this 3 multiplier. Does that make sense? Now that we move these, we probably want to grab all of these keyframes and just right-click and go to the keyframe interpolation and make sure that the spatial setting is set to linear. And you can see these are all going to straighten out instead of being so curvy and wonky. That's probably more what we want in this case. All right, and then lastly, what we have is the randomizer. This is going to do just exactly what you think. If I just select scale, rotation, and opacity, it's going to randomize those values based on our minimum and maximum set right here. And again, these are keyframeable, so if I just set a opacity, rotation, and scale keyframe, move forward 10 frames, and randomize them. Just move down and keep doing it. It's just going to keep picking different random values to move in between. Kind of like wiggling. one final note, this checkbox over here is to constrain the scale proportion. So if I want to uncheck that, I can scale this, and it's going to scale each dimension, X and Y, separately rather than together. Okay, so that's it. I hope you're feeling inspired to go and create something great. Over the next weeks and months, I plan on releasing a series of tutorials to delve further into the possibilities afforded by After Effects and these scripting tools. So have fun, and I'll see you next time.